Today, the IMF finally gets with the Oz household debt problem. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Until now, the IMF has been warning in general terms of the risks from our household sector. But in a recent working paper entitled Household Debt, Consumption and Monetary Policy in Australia, they take the issue significantly further. Within its 39 pages, the paper discusses the evolution of the household debt in Australia and finds that while higher income and higher wealth households tend to have higher debt, lower income households may become more vulnerable to rising debt service over time. Then, the paper analyses the impact of a monetary policy shock on households' current consumption and durable expenditures, depending on the level of household debt. The results corroborate other work that households' response to monetary policy shocks depends on their debt and income levels. In particular, households with higher debt tend to reduce their current consumption and durable expenditures more than other households in response to a contractory monetary policy shock. However, households with low debt may not respond to monetary policy shocks as they hold more interest-earning assets. And we should say at this point that IMF working papers describe research in progress by the authors and are published to elicit comments and to encourage debate. The views expressed in the IMF working papers, therefore, are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF, its executive board, or IMF management. Household debt in Australia has increased to comparatively high levels over the last 3 decades, they say, a period during which housing prices also have risen rapidly. And by the end of September 2018, the ratio of household debt to household gross disposable income reached 189%, which is among the highest in the advanced economies. High levels of household debt are widely considered to be risky, as they can amplify the impact of external and domestic shocks and therefore increase a country's economic and financial vulnerabilities and pose risks to financial stability, they said. In addition to amplifying financial and economic vulnerabilities, high household debt can also intensify the ongoing corrections in the housing market in Australia. The macroeconomic impact of and the risks from household debt depends not only on the average debt level, but also its distribution across households. Higher income households may be at lower risk of default of debt compared with lower income households, for example. The latter might also be more likely to be finance constrained in times of debt distress. So, from a monetary policy perspective, a key consideration is the extent to which household debt levels and distribution affect monetary policy transmission. Household debt in Australia has been rising faster than household disposable income for the past 3 decades. As a result, the household debt ratio has risen to one of the highest levels among advanced economies. The housing boom has also played a significant role in the rapid accumulation of household debt. High housing demand due to income and population growth, in conjunction with relatively inelastic supply, have pushed up house prices, and expectations of future capital gains have encouraged investment demand for housing. Now, that statement really typifies the pretty standard but wrong view that home prices are driven by demand and population growth. Of course, we know that the true answer is credit availability. Anyway, they go on to say, the interaction between long-term upswings in housing prices and relatively easy mortgage financing has therefore led to the build-up of a high level of residential mortgage debt. Now, they're absolutely right on that. High household debt, they say, also reflects the preference for home ownership and housing investment in Australia. Housing debt at 140% of household disposable income accounted for about 3/4 of household debt outstanding as at September 2018, with owner-occupied housing debt accounting for a relatively stable share of about 1/2. The rise in the share of investor housing debt since 2000 has also contributed to the fast increase in household debt, they said, while other personal debt has remained broadly stable. For financial stability, as well as monetary and macroprudential policies, it is not only the level of household debt that matters, but also the speed of debt accumulation or leverage increases, the extent of leverage, and more importantly, the distribution of debt. Now, let me say here that the IMF uses old data from the Hilda survey, which has been running with annual frequency from 2001 to 2016 to make their assessment. This is the same data that the RBA uses, and it's so out of date as to be pretty laughable. Clearly, the debt position has deteriorated since then, yet they show that even on this out-of-date data, the debt has grown across the cohorts and segments. The RBA analysis has the same fundamental flaws. But the paper finds that high debt exposure is more prevalent among higher income and higher wealth households. Nevertheless, the debt exposure of lower income and more vulnerable households has also increased over time, and thereby more exposed to risks from rising debt service. And that's really the point. It's the same that we see in our data, that high debt is not just connected to high net worth and high wealth segments, but the overall level of debt across the economy is much higher. And I also happen to think that the high levels of debt amongst affluent households are now also at risk. But they conclude that the presence of over-indebted households at both low and high income quintiles suggests that macro financial risks have increased, suggesting a need for close monitoring. Despite the high debt levels, they say, households' debt service burden has remained manageable due to historic low mortgage interest rates. And given that financial institutions assess mortgage serviceability for new mortgage lending with interest rate buffers above the effective variable rate applied for the term of the loans. That, of course, is the classic defence which people like Christopher Joy use to explain why we don't have an issue. Unfortunately, I think it's rather myopic. However, they say downside risks on debt service capacity and consumption remain with regard to a sharp tightening of global financial conditions, which could spill over to higher domestic interest rates. Now, my take on all this is that the household debt is larger and more exposed to potential risks than many accept, including the RBA. Now, this is nothing new, perhaps, but the IMF highlighting the issues is one more piece of the too high debt narrative. And according to the AFR in an exclusive interview, the International Monetary Fund's lead economist for Australia, Thomas Hebling, said Australia's housing market contraction is worse than first thought, leaving the economy in what he called a delicate situation that boosts the need for faster infrastructure spending and even potential interest rate cuts. Australia's housing market contraction is worse than first thought. So standing back, 3 points to make. First, this is the first time that the IMF has really spelled out the risks relating to household debt in Australia. Second, whilst it perpetuates much of the myth propagated by the RBA, it is also attacking much more clearly the fact that debt is not just sitting amongst those who can handle it, and therefore households are more at risk should things change, particularly from an overseas perspective in terms of a downturn, or if interest rates were to rise. And the third point I want to make is that we've dug ourselves into this really, really deep debt hole. And from this point, it's going to be very difficult to unwind it, particularly as home prices fall. The IMF says that people with big debts, when the economic outlook is less certain, will spend less and will hunker down. And that is precisely what we are seeing at the moment. Or in other words, the current economy in Australia is being significantly hit by the over-high household debt. And that, of course, is a message that I've been preaching for a number of years. And I do think that the chickens are now coming home to roost. If you found this post useful and helpful, please like it, share it, add a comment or a question. I read them all. And if you haven't yet subscribed, do subscribe to receive alerts on future posts. And before I go, just a quick reminder that our next live stream event will be on Tuesday, the 16th of April at 8 p.m. Sydney time. Here is a link that you can use to schedule the event. And if you want to ask a question, you can ask me live via the chat, or indeed send it through beforehand via the DFA blog, and the links to that are in the comments below. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.